of Indigenous people and Native American people so that they could be at the table talking to us, and also for us, because our work is social justice work, and it is dismantling whiteness, dismantling white supremacy, and this concept of superiority. I think we both came into the work with a lot of respect and being really humbled as students. And so for me, like anytime that I am in a space where I feel like I've actually learned a lesson, it isn't like I have something now to teach someone else. It's more like an awareness of something that I didn't know before. And I think I am more aware now of what I didn't know and how much more there is for me to know, of course. But I just feel like it was a really, it's been a really wonderful week. And I feel like today is going to be a continuation of that work that we need to do. So I feel more calm too, because I'm usually like, and today I'm like very sad. Like I'm in a sad place. I'm toning it down to like a 6.
Yeah, but I don't think that's by mistake. I mean, one of the things that's really stood out to me about this this festival is how deeply spiritually grounded all of our guests have been. And I'm not saying that, I'm really careful to say that, because there's a way in which Native American people are frequently reduced in popular culture as, you know, they're so spiritual and like fairies, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a 21-year-old who understands the power of plants and the power of reverence for life and gratitude. You know, I think anytime you're around those kinds of teachers, it stills you, it forces you to go back and ask yourself some deeper questions about how you're living, how you're showing up, how you could deepen yourself. And I'm really humbled for that. I mean, I yesterday, you know, we had this really beautiful day with food sovereignty. Kirsten came on and she was offering us some very deep lessons. She's not 21, but she looks like she's 21. And she's just this well of wisdom. And then afterwards, we were in a session that was with these Pacific Island gorgeous artist souls. And the way I described it with Clay, we were all crying, first of all. And I described it to Clavis afterwards as it felt, my heart was so full, so full. It was saying to me like, okay, we've been at an all day soul buffet. It's time to digest all this food, you know? And that's what I hope some of today and this particular workshop is for all of us. Let's begin grappling with all these yummy things we've been digesting all week. And then let's also see what can we do with this moving forward, because the point of all of these festivals is not just to gather and revel and be inspired and feel good. You know, it doesn't stop there. The point is always, then what? And then what? How do you take this and move forward? How do you take this and build the kind of life we all deserve, right? And the kind of society we're all here for, that hopefully we voted for in November. Yeah, so we're really excited to have you here. We are gonna dive right in. Sounds good?
Let's go.
All right. So as a beginning, I would like to share something. Again, it's really important to Clevis and I that you, as our, you know, as our co-learners, are really clear that we're here to learn together. We're not pretending we have all of the answers, very far from it. The part of the reason why we put something like this together is so that we can be students 0 and 0. And then the other thing that's important is in this work, we are even more humble students. We're even more guests because neither one of us is Indigenous, right? So we'd love to begin this work on, bear with me just a moment. We'd love to begin this with some words and wisdom from Native Indigenous elders. So before I begin playing this, I'm going to ask you to please turn off any sound that you may have in the background. if you have a television going or radio, I'd like you to please come into a place of just deep listening. And if you can also put your feet on the ground, so you are literally grounded, and pay attention to your breath throughout this video I'm about to share. And I also ask you to just be aware and bring some consciousness to your presence. Be here with us as completely as you can. I'll give you just a second to get yourself together if you need that. Great, thank you.
The Thanksgiving address is one of the most important parts of our culture that can be conveyed to the outside world. The Thanksgiving address is an address. It is not a prayer. We are actually, with our language, speaking to those parts of creation and thanking them, and then having the whole gathering send that Thanksgiving out to those parts of creation.
It lays our relationship to the universe of how we're to behave and how to respect the universe we live in.
It's a directive, and it's also a summation of our cosmology. It tells us in the beginning to be respectful and to be thankful. And that's where the idea of Thanksgiving comes in.
The Thanksgiving address is such a beautiful oration. I think of it as this river of words that takes us to an orientation of gratitude. It reminds us to acknowledge that we're not alone in the world, that our very lives are dependent upon the gifts of all of these other beings with whom we share the planet.
Any gathering we have, whether it's a large one or a small one, whether it's a meeting of the Council of Chiefs or whether it's ceremony or clan meeting, the Thanksgiving address is put out before all.
One of the parts of it that I think is so powerful is that cadence that says, let us bring our minds together as one. I think we can think about the Thanksgiving address as an example of native science. In a way, it is a listing of all of the elements of the ecosystem.
Start with the Ganohanu, we call the Thanksgiving address. I hand the guy with the words before all else. You give thanks for the people around you, that we're all here, and we're healthy, we're able to be here. And you give thanks for the Mother Earth, all the things that she provides for us. And then we go into the things that the Creator has set down here for us.
You're thankful for water, for the corn and all the vegetation, the trees, the sun, we call it our older brother, the moon.
To the animals running about, the berries, the birds, and kindly and respectfully we put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude.
So we talk about the soft winds that bring the seasons. When we talk about the thundering beings, the thundering voices, we call our grandfathers. We call the winds our grandfathers. Personify them. Respect them. We love them.
And so we continue on in that model of Thanksgiving in our ceremonies throughout the year.
Well, the ceremonies are part of the acknowledgement. It all relates to the Thanksgiving address. It all relates to the work that the Creator has put into Mother Earth.
Because we're dependent on everything. That's why we keep our ceremonies going, to say thank you for the gifts of life every day.
It takes you to that place of Thanksgiving, and everyone has that place where you're feeling that feeling of being grateful for what you have.
It's a renewal, it's a continuation, great authority, great instruction, good values.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to now please stay in the same seated position, still focusing on your breath. And if you can, please.
It's Shiori.
What?
Shiori.
Adam, Emily, and then
Shiori.
Shahori.
Just stay with your stillness. Focus on your breath.
Since this is in Onondaga, I thought maybe it would be nice to read it for you in English also.
And if you're comfortable with it, I invite you to please close your eyes for this section. This is the actual Thanksgiving address, and I'm only going to play the audio. It's from All of My Relations, which is a podcast by two Native women. Again, I ask you, if you're comfortable, please close your eyes and just take in these words.
Scano. Ona engat kakne o handu kai hote quick. Kana hanyu kayasu. Daunette Gohya Dentwetanu hat. Ne toti neotik ne ungwa ni goha. Daunette Gohya what the tinu hat. Ne itinoha sa ohwenjate. Ne toti neotik ne ungwa ni goha.
So now, in fact, indeed, we thank and greet each other. There, then let it be that way in our minds. We thank our Mother Earth. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank every kind of medicine. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank them, every kind of tree and bush. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank them, every kind of berry. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank them, every kind of animal that runs around. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank water. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank life sustainers, food. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we think where the winds stir. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank our grandfathers, the thunders. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank and greet him, our elder brother, the sun. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank Grandmother Moon. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank the four protectors. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank our leader, Handsome Link. There, then let it be that way in our minds. So now, in fact, indeed, we thank our Creator, who lives in the sky. There, then let it be that way in our minds. Having a holiday that only gives thanks one time a year is dangerous, because we have ways in our communities of offering thanks and giving thanks on a regular basis that shapes the way that we interact with the world. An example of that is that we have a salmon ceremony every year. And the salmon ceremony is this thing that we do where our whole community comes together and we give thanks to the salmon before we harvest any more salmon. We sing, and then we put together a spirit plate, and our fishermen go out to the four corners of our sea and they offer it to the ocean, and we give thanks. And then every time there forward that we go out and harvest, before we take anything from the ocean, we give thanks. We stop. we make an offering for the water. And we do the same thing on our canoes. Before we get onto the water, before we like step foot in the canoe, we dip our paddle in the water and we give thanks to the water for carrying us, for allowing us to be there. One of our belief systems is to go take a dip and to cleanse ourselves. And we do that cleansing on a regular basis. You know, we go to the salt water to give thanks, to cleanse ourselves, and we make an offering to the water of tobacco, or we make an offering with our hair, but we definitely make an offering with song, and we announce ourselves and we give thanks to the water. And when we do that on a regular basis, it changes my physical interaction with the water. You know, like I don't ever go to a new place and get into the water without first introducing myself. You know, like I will stand at the shore and introduce myself, my ancestors, and who I am, and ask permission to go into the water before I actually do that. And that has to do with years of being trained that it's my responsibility to give thanks.
Okay, you can open your eyes again now if you haven't already. Thank you so much for just taking this moment to ground and to listen to our elders, because I think one of the things that's true is, you know, the wisdoms that are alive in Native American elders and ancestors. There's something beautiful about thinking about those ancestors as ours as well. And this is an invitation, and this is definitely following the teaching of Joy Harjo, who invited us on Thursday to think about our ancestors beyond bloodlines and to start thinking about ancestors at a spiritual level, right? So us gathering with respect and listening first to our elders is a way for us to ground ourselves and to remind ourselves of this deep teaching all of our native creatives have reminded us constantly. We're related, we are relatives, we're not strangers to one another. I'm going to share my screen, but as I do, I'm going to ask Clevis to come in and share a little bit of why the two of us thought it was so important to have this particular festival. What is our why?
Yeah, so you know, I started to talk to this a few minutes ago. I think that because Mahohodi and I are both immigrant women in this country, I think we know firsthand what it feels like to be considered an outsider, both here in the United States and often at home. You know, we go back as immigrants and you become this new thing that often people are suspicious of your existence, like the ulterior motive of those of us that are migrants. And so, you know, part of the why for us has changed over time. I think when we first started talking about doing this festival at the heels of, you know, the COVID-19 festival we did in March, then we did the Black Lives Matter, and we were thinking a lot about being in solidarity with the Native American community. And we ourselves had noticed through revolutionary movements that have happened in this country that the conversation tends to be very black and white in the United States. And a lot of times when we talk about social justice, it's very binary, the conversation. And for us, when we start really understanding the plight of indigenous societies, both in the United States and globally, this whole concept of preservation becomes really critical. And the concept of preservation, both of the human body, but also of nature, like there's a way in which indigenous people have taught us both through our studies, both in literature and what we've done in preparation for this, you know, for the workshop and for this festival, that when we're thinking about preservation looks really differently when we talk to indigenous communities, but there's also a lot of overlap. I mean, when we spoke to Nikki Giovanni, that keynote, and then we spoke to Joy Harjo, there were so many common themes in terms of how the ancestors have laid the groundwork for us, how the impulse to live and enjoy life, in joy and in love, is encoded in our own bodies, because those of us who have survived genocide, those of us who have survived colonization and enslavement are here because our ancestors refused to die. They found ways to live and to continue on. So for us, you know, the workshop today is really continuing the work that, you know, Love as a Kind of Cure is invested in doing, which is to dismantle inequality. We're going to continue to do it in cross-sectional ways, and we are going to do it by listening and by learning just as much as we teach, and just as much as we lead by example based on our own lived experiences. So for us, you know, this is a really critical moment, and we both see it as a turning point. 2020 has been such a trying year for most of us. You know, for both of us, Mahahodi and I, who have experienced the pandemic firsthand through our families, you know, our communities, and then also what's happening globally. We understand it to be a campaign of hatred. And so when we talk about how do we combat the campaign for hatred, it is a campaign of love that we are offering. And so, you know, I think there's more there, but Mahodi, I can't see you, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm here. And
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the campaign of love, you know, I think we should TM that, because that's gorgeous and that's exactly right. I will also say here, our guest today was supposed to be Daunette Reyome, this gorgeous, young, brilliant Native American woman from the Wampanoag tribe. She's not able to join us, and we really want to acknowledge why. COVID-19 is something that has struck really hard in the Native American communities. Their statistics are like through the roof. It's bizarre. Something like close to 5 times more likely to be hospitalized, 3 times more likely to, you know, die from COVID than a white counterpart. And Daunette has been recovering herself from COVID-19. I know that she really wanted to be here, but it just, it didn't make sense. She needs to tend to herself and her family, which we obviously support. But we wanted to give that acknowledgement and to really encourage everybody on this call to think deeply about how are we showing up, especially for Native American communities right now, who are dealing with COVID-19 in a way that is fundamentally different from any other community, including Black and Latinx communities. So today's roadmap, just to give you a sense of where we're going to go, those of you who were with us last time at Freedom Festival, you may be a little familiar with the Love, Kind, Cure framework, which is focusing on knowledge, and then and knowledge really from many different ways of knowing. We do not privilege the Western idea of knowledge is only what is in ivory towers, what is academic. There are multitude ways of knowing, and especially if we're talking about Native American and Indigenous knowledge, we're keen to bring that in, which sometimes is information that lives in our cellular memories, sometimes it's information that lives in our bodies. It can live in seeds, as we learned yesterday from Kirsten. It can live in water, in the wind, and we're open and here to listening and to learning from all those different ways of knowing. And then we focus on, well, what can we do? How can we activate ourselves? And also taking stock of what we already are doing, right? Action is not just what is being done, kinetic energy, it's also taking stock and a self-awareness of what has been done and what is not done, and how both of those things play together and do the second and this third and last, which is creating a better future. Once you know better, hopefully, and you're more aware of your actions, how can you then create a better future? So we'll take you through an exercise that is both looking at the facts, the fiction, and some of the myths behind Thanksgiving. And then we will begin hopefully reimagining. It's not going to be complete. I mean, we're here for a short period of time, and our work is igniting some of that reimagination and giving you homework that becomes a way of life. You know, I really resonate with what the woman at All Our Relations podcast invited us into. The idea that Thanksgiving is one day on the calendar where we give thanks is it's very cheeky. And it's something to contest with. You know, one of the things we definitely want to invite from our gathering today is, how do we learn from our Native American relatives and think about Thanksgiving as something we live with daily as a practice?
And before you move on, I
Yes.
think one thing too that we talk a lot when we talk about our learning framework is a reminder that the work that we need to do starts as interior work. So, you know, we begin with ourselves because that's where we have the most control to both change the way that we think and the way that we feel and the way that we understand the world that is around us. And like Mahohori said, a lot of it to me is also like a greater awareness. And when we think about even what the intention of Thanksgiving has been and how it has been, you know, just the toxicity around it now, where like, even beyond being thankful one day a week, it's become like a shopping holiday, right? Like now it's the beginning of the holidays. And are you ready for Black Friday? And are you ready to get the deals? And, you know, I think there's just like so much at work here that we inadvertently buy into and participate. So, I mean, I think to me, so much of the work that needs to be done, both in activation and in understanding what we're up to today, is also like a greater awareness of how even the intention of what's supposed to be the holiday has already been distorted greatly.
Yeah, amen. So as a beginning, we're going to invite you into an exercise. Both Clevis and I will lead you through this. I'll describe it overall, what the intention is. I'm gonna give you about 2 seconds, not minutes, 2 seconds, to please grab a pen, something to jot down on if you need a journal or you know, a piece of paper.
Here's my example.
You're on your second, so.
I brought like 2 in case.
Oh, all right, great. So we're really interested in beginning at the beginning, where we are right now, right? Everybody comes to this workshop with different inherited ideas, truths, myths, family folklore about and around Thanksgiving. You know, one of the things that's true is, as immigrants, we both really resonate with this holiday because it feels like the holiday in America that is most tethered to our cultures and their reverence for family and for gathering and for food. Sure, Thanksgiving has become co-opted, as Clevis was saying recently, by commercialism and the rush for Black Friday, but there is still this way in which Thanksgiving feels like COVID 101, you know, maybe like when COVID was first beginning and it was just about sinking down into, wow, I have time enough and I have my family and these are things to be thankful for, right? For a lot of people who have privilege, that was the beginning of COVID-19. Maybe that was a very bad analogy, so I'll just scratch that.
Yeah, that was terrible.
But I think you understand what I'm going for. The invitation here and what we'd love you to do is to think about your own family traditions and what Thanksgiving means to you. Clevis, for the, you want to lead them any further, or should I keep going?
No, you keep going.
Okay, so we're inviting you here to write down on a piece of paper the facts that you might know about Thanksgiving, What do you know about the historical narrative? And that can be, you know, what you learned in school. It doesn't necessarily have to be what you are critiquing as an adult. Just write down the facts as you know them about Thanksgiving. Write down the fiction of Thanksgiving. So what are any myths that you know in the popular culture that are maybe your family myths? Do you embrace them? Do you refute them? You know, this doesn't have to be an essay, it can be just bullet points. And then we would like you to write down your family traditions. What are your family traditions? I think I wrote that twice, so you can ignore it if it's double. And I want to call your attention before you begin to this really powerful quote by John F. Kennedy. He says that the great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, but the myth. Persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So, number one, why do we pick this quote by a white American man who represents the United States and, you know, the government of the United States that is responsible for breaking all these treaties with Native Americans? That was very purposeful. This quote is pulled from an address that he gave at Yale University to a bunch of graduating students there. Yale is in Connecticut. This is New England. These lands are the first place where Native American people were faced with colonization by Europeans. And to us, one of the things that's really fascinating and almost sinister in this quote is the complete awareness of what the work of a myth is, right? And how the myth of Thanksgiving, how powerful that can be. For somebody like JFK to be this aware is fascinating, and it deserves pause, and it deserves us in relationship to Thanksgiving, in relationship to the United States and its history and our grappling with that, just taking all of that in. So we'll give you about 5 minutes, literally, to respond to these questions on your piece of paper. 2 more minutes. Okay. Hopefully you have some interesting thoughts, jot it down. We're going to return to this exercise, so I'm going to ask you to just keep this somewhere close. We're next going to turn to looking at Thanksgiving from an informational perspective and thinking about the knowledge base, right? Both what actually happened, what is the history of Thanksgiving, and what is a way to wrap your head around 400 years of history. This year is 2020, so it's 1620 is when the ship Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. This is the landmark of that 400 year in between. And we're sharing this video with you by Paul Chaat Smith, who is a curator at the Smithsonian, Native American. And I think it's a brilliant way of compressing, if you can, 400 years through the lens of Thanksgiving and starting to grapple with what are some of the truths and untruths. On the other side of that, we'll have a small conversation about some of the history that we've learned, and we'll take it from there. So let's see this film.
All right. So, what is Thanksgiving?
Can you see this okay? No?
We're on the slide still. It's not coming.
Technical. Give me just one moment, please. Technicalities there. You are sharing screen. Yes, share the screen.
It happened yesterday when I was trying to do it, remember?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. Share this. Still nothing?
No, it's not coming.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, here.
All right, great. Let's try this again. Thanks for being patient.
All right. So, what is Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving is insane. It's this huge, incredible disaster on highways and airports, and it's crowded and the weather's awful. A meal that takes days, sometimes weeks of preparation, emotional turmoil, fights. But the fact that it's a national holiday that really envelops everyone. It's a sense of the entire country in motion in a way that isn't really like any other day in American life. And the way it's corny, it's cartoonish and kitsch is kind of a protective layer to sort of not get too direct about it. So underneath all those things, Thanksgiving is about trying to come to terms with this very difficult truth about the United States, that the country is a national project that came about at great expense to Native people. And it's not enough that we're a good country. We kind of have to be the best country, you know? But Native people and African slavery, those two things together are huge challenges to how you process this. So eventually the country ended up deciding, you know what, we like the story about that meal at Plymouth a long, long time ago, in which these newly arrived people from England in this new country had their brunch in the forest with Indians. And what was that saying? That was saying that we're neighborly. We want this to work out. And we know it didn't all work out, but that's what we aspire to be. That's sort of our best selves.
Did that meal actually happen?
It happened, but nobody really cared. It wasn't like, oh, remember that time last November, let's have those folks over again, fire up the grill. Nobody thought that because it was just a thing that happened. But the Pilgrim folks there, they were writing letters or writing journals. They were like really meticulously detailing what was happening. But even that written account gets lost for basically 200 years and doesn't even emerge until the 1840s when this document is discovered again. And even then, it's not a big deal. It's actually in a footnote. And we remember that, we rescue it from being a footnote because that has meaning now. And so by the early 20th century, Indians are an indivisible part of what creates the United States. It's not a chapter that happened and it was bad and we got over it. We're in your head, we're in your pantry, we're in your garage. This imagery, representations, advertising, Thanksgiving says, however imperfectly we remember Indians, we're remembering Indians. And with all the problems with it, it's still a powerful idea, and it's still powerful to not Photoshop Indians out of the national narrative, to say, we're owning this. And there's a way that can open up ways to start thinking about it differently, opens up for people to become activists and try to change things, invent some new kind of Thanksgiving. Let's have the discussion. Let's see where that goes. But before you get to the lessons and is it right to use that? Is it whatever? I don't know. I guess if I were to put myself in terms of, this a cartoon Indian and all this at Thanksgiving, I'd probably be saying, I'm glad to be here. Better than the alternative.
Yeah, that's some really powerful, I think especially the note that he ends on, it's better to be here than not to be here. I mean, it really lands hard. And it reminds me of something we heard earlier on Sunday at our kickoff brunch when we had David Trua. I don't think I'll ever forget this quote. He said that our job as Native Americans has always been to be dead in the consciousness of America. America has an insistence that the role of Native Americans is to be dead, and we've always refused that role, right? And if I think about some of the salient, like trying to distinguish between the myths and the received knowledge of what Thanksgiving is, or the pretense of what America wants it to be about, comparing that to the real footnotes of what Thanksgiving is really fascinating. So just some level set, some things that I've come to understand from learning, from asking, and from listening. In 1620, the Mayflower arrives. And when it arrives in Wampanoag country, these European people found a wide and deeply populated coastal land. There were millions of Native American people throughout Turtle Island, but specifically in the Wampanoag area, there was a lot of vitality of people and life. But one of the things that's complicated, and I think an undertold component of the story, is this is not the first time that Europeans had contact with Native people in 1620. It had already been happening actually for more than about 100 years. And at that first contact, the Wampanoags were actually very wary and kept their distance. Their whole thing was, let's just check these people out, because they didn't know that they could trust them. Why is that? Their history already, like I said, there'd already been contact with Europeans. That earlier contact had not been good. Native American people had already been stolen from Wampanoag country and other places along the coast and taken into bondage and enslaved in Europe. And some of them never returned to those lands. So if you're seeing these dudes coming upon your coast, you're gonna be like, let me check this out. I'm not sure, like, we're not gonna be buddy-buddy like that, right? The winter was really harsh. That's a factual thing that the Pilgrims experienced, and they needed help. And one of the things we learned this past week from Danielle, who is Wampanoag herself, is that the Wampanoag people, the way they experienced it is, we're not going to let them die. So we're skeptical of these people, but it's not okay to let them die. They taught them then how to harvest, or rather how to farm the land. They gave them some seeds, they gave them some food so that they could survive, because again, some things that are uncomfortable to talk about, and this is in history books, is these Europeans, when they first came, they were so hungry and they were so battered by crossing the ocean that they were actually digging up graves, the Wampanoag people's burial grounds, and feeding themselves on corn that had been stored from previous winters in this particular village that was decimated by disease, because again, there had already been contact with Europeans. And another thing that I think is worth bringing up is the myth that we often carry in this country about pilgrims coming here seeking religious freedom. That's not the full story either. You know, pilgrims already had a lot of religious freedom and movement in the Netherlands, which was a safe haven in Europe. So was there religious persecution in Europe? Yes, there was. Was there a safe haven that a lot of people were actually congregating in, a lot of Quakers specifically, and other religions that were persecuted? Yes, there was. The primary motive for risking everything and coming over all of these oceans was economic. It was capital. So that's really important because it sets the stage for what happens afterwards. There's also this narrative that's often told of, you know, the Europeans invited the Wampanoag people to come over and have this lovely dinner together. Well, there was a lot of, the Europeans were firing off guns. And I live up in upstate New York, and that's quite a common thing up here, and I hate it. You often hear people just shooting in their backyard. I don't know where they're shooting, but I hear it. And when I hear it, it always alarms me, and it's the kind of thing that would startle you. So you can imagine these European people are in a foreign place, they start shooting. I guess they're practicing or making sure that their guns work. I don't know. And the Wampanoag hear this and they're alarmed. Already they don't trust them. Already they feel like, you know, this isn't a normal sound. So a bunch of them go over, men armed, to go and investigate, hey, what's going on? What are you doing, right? And initially there's a tense standoff, and then eventually it's resolved and there's some food that's exchanged. And that's where this myth of Thanksgiving and the first gathering comes from. As he said in the video, that really gets lost. It's not part of American mythology for the first 200 plus years. It's not until Lincoln comes along and America is at this really deep rift and thinking about how we're going to come together again as a country. Maybe a year a lot like 2020, right? And Abraham Lincoln looks, I don't know, maybe some advisors like, yo, dude, do you know that this thing happened? And that's when Thanksgiving becomes a national holiday. Abraham Lincoln is the person who institutes this idea of, you know, we can gather around, we can have a way of bringing the country together. But one of the things that's troublesome about even that indoctrinating and that invitation towards Thanksgiving as a national project is the very next day, he then goes out and commits one of the biggest genocides that's ever happened on Turtle Island. He kills 38 Lakota men. There's a beautiful poem by Lady Long Soldier, which we highly recommend you check out. And she grapples with that history and what does it mean to, on one hand, emancipate the slaves, create this myth-making holiday around Thanksgiving, and then in the very next breath, kill 38 Lakota men because they insist that the land is theirs and they have birthright to it. Let me pause there. Clevis.
Well, I think part of the things that we're grappling with today and what we hope that you will be thinking about into the future is the ways in which the holiday today stands both within the mythology of our own families and what it means in this country, and then reflecting on what we've heard this week from some of the folks that we talked about. I mean, Danielle Hill, who is, you know, she started us off last Sunday and she talked at length about, you know, the pain that is associated with this holiday. For a lot of tribes in this country, it is a day of mourning and it is a day of sadness. And for me, I mean, that's honestly the first time I ever heard that was when Danielle talked about it. It had a great impact on me personally because, again, within the context of what we're talking about, which is cross-sectional justice, I think part of what we're trying to create is like an awareness of what it means to like look at a story in different and nuanced ways. And so for me, I think when Joy Harjo was talking on Thursday night about allowing each other to have space in our own lives to listen to the other stories and like, what does it mean at Thanksgiving for everyone to be around the story, around a table and all the stories are being exchanged? To me, that is an example of what that means, is that, you know, I came to this country in 6th grade. I remember like each holiday. Now that I have children, it's interesting because I see my children being indoctrinated into this same idea of Thanksgiving as a holiday that celebrates unity, that celebrates solidarity, that celebrates difference, you know, and Native people are always painted as people that were welcoming and that were accepting, and that whatever happened, we're not gonna talk too much about the horrors that happened. We're just gonna focus on this meal when everybody was being friends. And we know that's been greatly distorted. So part of this, I think, for us is really, first of all, thinking about grappling with that, just like the fact and the myth. And then for us, really, the activation is in the reimagination. And we talked about like how are other artists and other people thinking about myth making, and how do we combat the myth making? So, you know, that's gonna be part of what we want to invite you to do, why we asked you at the beginning to just write down, what are your myths? What do you understand to happen? And as a reminder for those of you that are new to this workshop and new to love as a kind of cure, for us, like part of imagining better, doing better and imagining better go hand in hand with, for us artists, because both of us are writers and both of us believe that, you know, we put artists and creatives at the center as leaders because they help us and they give us examples of how we can recreate these kind of dangerous and terrible myths. So for us, you know, we wanted to give you an example of how you can really, you know, just really like look at the history of what has happened, look at the representation of what has happened, and then how do we tackle it to reimagine it and do it again.
Yeah. So we wanted to share this particular reimagination, which we think is quite provocative. Norman Rockwell has this really powerful series of artworks. They're part of a collective called the Four Freedoms, and this one I believe is called Freedom from Hunger on the left. And this iconographic painting about the first Thanksgiving kind of speaks to the myth that I was describing earlier, right? And what stands out to me looking at both of these is they are such beautiful examples of that quote we started off with, JFK's President JFK's quote about the myth and how myths are far more potent and difficult enemies of truth than a lie. There's nothing harmful here in what you're seeing, except when you understand the violence that is not being properly portrayed. The image on the right, the first Thanksgiving, you know, one of the shocking things for me when I first began understanding that very first footnote Thanksgiving is when the Pilgrims first got here, a celebrated figure that often comes up in elementary schools all over the country is Squantum, and how great it is that there was this Native American man who could interpret for the Pilgrims, right? Well, it turns out Squantum is a real factual ancestor. He really lived. His full name would be Squantum, and there's suspicion in the text. Historians debate this, whether Squantum was even his name, because it translates roughly to something like like a great wrath and about anger. And it seems like a pseudonym to a lot of historians. Squantum is somebody who knew English because he had been enslaved. Remember when I said there was already contact with Europeans? Well, and there was already a lot of distrust. He's really unusual because he's somebody who was stolen in the neighborhood of about 1616 or 1615. He must have been quite young, and taken initially to Spain, and then he ended up in England where he learned the language. And somehow, you know, really ingenious somebody, he made his way back to his village in Wampanoag country. And when he came back, again, because there had already been contact with Europeans, his entire village was decimated by disease. And he became this go-between. You know, he all the things that had happened in his life made him the kind of person who lives between places. And that's why he was interpreting to the Pilgrims. And he was also one step in the world of his youth and his people, right? So this particular series of paintings is really fascinating because it perpetuates the myth of Thanksgiving, but we love thinking about it in relationship to this next slide and the work that Frank Willis Thomas and Emily Shur have done, reimagining Thanksgiving and creating more space for all of us, and the multitude of not just faces, but families. You know, America is so many different things. It does not look like Norman Rockwell's America. And we love these series of paintings. We really encourage you actually to look this up, because it's not just these two reinterpretations, it's an entire series that they did. But there's a very powerful invitation for all of us to reimagine Thanksgiving, right? And it's really important, I believe, to use some of that reimagination in how we lionize the holiday itself. How do we tell a new myth that fits who we are, and maybe better yet, who we're becoming? I'm gonna pause at this just for a moment so everybody can take in this deliciousness. Yeah, it's good. And we'll return to this slide, but I think it's a good opportunity now to hear from somebody. So like I said at the top of the hour, Daunette isn't able to join us because of COVID-19 and tending to her family. This is Daunette here, this beautiful young woman. But we can hear from her and her friends through this beautiful video that they did. Are we having trouble with the share screen again?
Yeah, it's not sharing.
Okay, let me see. Yes?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, still same problem. Please bear with us, folks. Let me see if I can.
The one thing that I'll say until the video works is I've been thinking a lot too about like the persistence of this myth, because I know when I first started looking at this reimagining, you know, when you put these images next to each other, especially the myth and then, you know, a reimagination of that myth, you know, so much of it stands out to me in the context of, you know, what's missing, like the lack of diversity, the way that we think about families, the way that we think about honoring myths and heritage. And as a jumping off point for a lot of you that maybe think about your own families and you're like, oh, my family never even looks like that either. Like this idea too, that like what's the space that remains in any reimagining is your own take. And that's part of like what we want to invite you. I think it is provocative because it's also just giving us an example of what can be done when we tackle the myths in collaboration, because the two artists are working together in collaboration, and how that really makes us think twice about even the concept of family and gatherings. You want to try it again?
Yes. Can you see?
Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent.
The sound is not working, but we can see it.
Thanksgiving, America. I'm Daunette, and I'm here with my friends to tell you the real history behind this holiday. Growing up, I knew that what they told you in school about Thanksgiving wasn't true. That's not the true story. The true story behind Thanksgiving was, after every killing of a whole village, these European settlers celebrated it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln became president that it became an official holiday. He ordered 38 Dakota men to be hung for war crimes after the sacred holiday Christmas. We take this time to remember our elders who lost their lives due to what really happened. Usually my mom makes a Native American dish for us and we pray. Growing up, I would be kind of annoyed that they didn't know what actually happened on Thanksgiving and that they're actually celebrating the deaths of many people and many tribes that were lost. Whether it's to give thanks or to be with your family, you should learn how the holiday was established in the first place. I'm thankful for being born indigenous to this continent. I'm thankful that I still have my culture. I'm thankful that my elders kept our culture alive all these years. I'm thankful to be indigenous, resilient, and alive. I'm thankful for us all to be able to stand together, stand strong, and stand as one. Happy Thanksgiving, America.
I appreciate those of you who wrote into the chat, sending good wishes for Daunette and her family. We talked about how, it's kind of chilling when you think about, what COVID-19 is doing across the country, but especially in the Indigenous and Native American communities. Mahahodi and I engaged with these conversations with a lot of our guests over the last week. Where they are seeing such an incredibly disproportionate and underrepresented, impact to their communities, but also like there isn't much media coverage in terms of really how stark it has been. So I mean, that's something to pause on, and Mahahodi and I wanted to pause because at this point in the conversation, we're gonna bring Daunette to talk about how do we re-envision Thanksgiving, how do we activate ourselves, with our new concept of being relatives of this larger community, to talk about that, and so we're both sorry that we will invite her back. She wants to be in conversation with us. So, once she feels better, we'll do a standalone event to have this conversation that we think is really critically important. But we think we can still have this conversation, right? That's critically important because we've heard all week long from so many of our guests about how do we activate, how do we re-envision. I was particularly moved yesterday. We had a panel with, Gisela McDaniel, who is a visual artist, and she invited 3 of her subjects who have, been painted to talk about their own activism and their own experience. And it's part of her body of work that she always shows her paintings with the audio of the person talking about surviving, and a lot of her work is centered on resilience of women who have survived and who are survivors of different gender-based crimes. So for me, like one of the things that was really striking, and I want to share with all of you who maybe weren't there yesterday, is that Dr. McDaniels, who is Gisela's mom, came on and was talking to us about surviving being in academia, which is a different kind of violence. And she was talking, but she started by talking about how she wasn't going to apologize for the fact that she couldn't speak her language in the way that her ancestors did, because she and her family survived. Her grandmother survived, being taken into one of these schools where like the entire point of being taken into the school was to rob Native American people of their language and of their culture. And, I was thinking a lot about that because we ended up, I mean, as Mahahodi said earlier in the day, we were all in tears. I mean, it was one of the most moving workshops we've both run, because it was really like people speaking from their heart about what it means to be resilient, what it means to celebrate resilience in the face of like another viral attack across this country, and then resilience in the context of how the reason that we still are here, right? Like those of us who have survived colonization and enslavement, and people of Native communities that have, survived genocide, survived because of, those people in their communities that were so committed to not letting their cultures be robbed. Even during these times, right? Like there was always a subversive way in which people kept their cultures alive. And so to me, like that's such a big takeaway for me of this week. We'll publish all of these conversations. We have the videos and they'll be on our YouTube channel. But I wanted to start just from that point, Mahahodi, because I felt like watching that video of Daunette, and I know that part of why we wanted to engage with her, like this sequence, right, was looking at the myth, looking at reinterpretation of the myth, and then talking to Daunette, who created and orchestrated this video, who invited every single one of those young women in that video is Daunette, someone Daunette knows from her community, and each of them, in a way, owning this history and saying like, we're not gonna accept it anymore. We're overturning this table, right? And so even though we're not able to have the conversation with her, I think it's still so powerful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, at this point, we really do want to turn our attention and your lens towards how do you begin reimagining for yourself this holiday. We shared with you some ways that some powerful artists like Hank and Emily, how they have taken something that is iconographic, right? Nobody gets to be more American, quote unquote, than Norman Rockwell and his paintings. And yet they found a way to expand the conversation and also to subvert the conversation and to say, hey, there's some things that are overlooked and some things that are violent, even if that wasn't your intention. But there is a violence that you're doing to me in how you refuse to see me and you refuse to see what my story is. And for us, the point of this workshop is really to try and activate all of us to think about today, here, now, like Native Americans here now, not in 1620, but in 2020, how are we honoring them when we gather at Thanksgiving? But beyond that, how do we practice gratitude every day towards our hosts? We're guests on this land. Somebody throughout this week, I wish I remembered who I can attribute this to, but one of our Native American guests said, even it was David Whedon. He said, even if you are here, you're born here and you die on these lands, you're a lifelong guest on our lands. And that really goes to the heart. If you are somebody's guest, how do you behave? And how do you acknowledge their generosity and express that? And what we would love to invite you to now is to go back to that piece of paper that we began with. Please find that. And we have a small exercise. Let me pull it up. Are you in shared screens, Clevis? Can you see this?
Not yet.
Okay, let me do that. Maybe? No? What's going on?
I can see a beautiful painting, yes.
Oh, is this it? Okay. We'd like you to think about what you do already around Thanksgiving. You've already cataloged all of the fiction. You've already cataloged the facts that you know, and you've already cataloged your family traditions, right? And everything is historic. It's looking back at what you have been doing and what you might be doing right now. We'd like to invite you to reimagine moving forward. How can you complicate all of those things, especially the traditions and the rituals and the family gatherings around Thanksgiving in a way that honors our hosts? We have some suggestions here for you that we've heard from the Native folks who have spoken throughout this week. One thing that I think has so much resonance is land back. It has resonance with me because I'm South African and we're fighting this battle ourselves. There's something really fascinating that's going on both in the States. It's a little bit older in Canada, that's around land acknowledgements, and that is understanding whose land you're on. We've previously, in different conversations this week, spoken about apps that you can check out that tell you, you put in a zip code and it tells you exactly, oh, you're on Lenape country, or who was there before you got there. This is really important work to begin to acknowledge. Maybe that's step one. It's acknowledging whose land you're on. But one thing that we're really emphatic about is listening to our Native relatives when they say that's not enough, you need to go beyond that and you need to start moving into action. And somebody gave a really beautiful analogy of a bottle of water in Clevis's hand that I grab, I take it, and is now in my hand. And I say to her, I acknowledge this. Actually, let's make it this pencil. I acknowledge that this pencil is yours, Clevis. Let's move on. There's still an injustice being done because just by simply acknowledging that the pencil is hers and yet it's in my power, I'm not really sure how that offers restitution or justice to Clevis. So what we've heard all throughout this week from our relatives is, it's great to acknowledge land, but how about you give some land back? And we need to be really clear about this. Land back doesn't necessarily mean displacing people who are on those lands. Land back is a reimagination of how power is distributed. And we all have ways of paying back reparations, if you will, to our indigenous neighbors. And that's part of our invitation to you today. What are some of the ways that you can give both acknowledge the land, but then start thinking about, okay, well, how am I giving land back? Kirsten yesterday was talking about different indigenous sources of food. Maybe that could be the way that you give land back, instead of making your entire shopping, your whole grocery and pantry list for Thanksgiving from Whole Foods. Look up the people who are in your neighborhood who are indigenous farmers and support them. That's one way that you could give land back. Another way is to think about, how do you indigenize your table? Could you...
Well, before you move on to that, hold on, because we have some yummy stuff happening in the chat.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I think Leah is saying that in Seattle you can pay rent to the Duwamish tribe, and she included a website. And Stephanie McKenna also said that in the East Bay area you can also do it. One of our guests yesterday gave us a website where you can look up the treaties, because every single state has treaties with indigenous communities and reservations. And every one of us, even if you are not familiar with what a treaty is, that may be in effect for your own state, there are treaties that you can become knowledgeable about. And you can also influence elected officials to act in honor of those treaties. Because a lot of the issues that we see is that oftentimes the treaties are not being honored. So to me, like just on the topic of land, Mahohodi, I think it's really important to know that there are indigenous communities and indigenous organizations that are working toward, sovereignty, and finding out what that means within the context of your own backyard is probably one of the most powerful things you can do to honor those. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to go and create like your own organization. I think give the people who are in the indigenous communities doing this work are the ones that we need to support and figure out a way to honor what they're doing. Yeah. Just wanted to put that in and to say thank you to our folks that are sharing these resources with us, because every time we do this, I learn something new.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And if there's more, please keep them coming. Something else we heard yesterday was the importance of language, and how learning somebody's language, especially if you're in their home, is a sign of respect. I can tell you, as a South African woman, one of the things that disturbs me to no end is the extent to which I'm asked on my land to speak a foreign language so that I can make somebody else more comfortable because they have been on my land for more than 400, 500 years, and they refuse to learn the most basic thing, like Dumela, Okai, Wapelana. I'm getting emotional even saying it, because it really is a sore spot. And I'm just asking the question, what would it be like if we gave enough of a damn to learn the languages that are still alive, so that we can honor people and show that kind of humility that comes with seeing somebody enough to care about, well, how do you say it the way that where you come from? That's another suggestion. There's a beautiful, Jay is sharing that land map, that app that lets you know, you can put in your zip code and it lets you know whose land you're on. Anything else, Clevis, before we move on?
Yeah, I just, when I interrupted you, you started talking about supporting, especially around the holiday season. I think, we have this tendency to overconsume. I'm guilty too. I mean, just because we're teaching the workshop doesn't mean we're also not out there trying to shop on Black Friday, to be sure. I think we'll have to be honest about consumption and the fact that, that's just part of our culture. So I think there's a way just to be more thoughtful about how we give to each other, and especially like, you know, your niece and nephews probably don't need another app on their, you know, iPads, don't need another LOL doll. So consider, you know, like doing, thinking differently out of the box. And the I Collective has generously offered to anyone that reaches out to them to provide lists. They do the work to make sure that the organizations and the companies that they give us resources and that they list are actually owned by Native and Indigenous people. Because sometimes just because something is named something doesn't necessarily mean that it's supporting that community or that the money goes back into that community. So, you know, what Mahahodi started saying before about indigenizing your table, you know, paying honor not just to the food itself, but the way it's grown, that there is respect in the way that food is grown and harvested, has been a huge takeaway for both of us this week. And so there are, you know, just wonderful resources out there, and we'd really like to encourage you to do that.
Yeah, I support that. And one thing I think is really important, and I know that this is going to be a tough reorientation of thinking for a lot of folks, is my deepest invitation is, as you do this work, please consider that you are not doing charity. When we ask you or ourselves to give land back, please find it inside of your expansiveness to give as a way of thanks, right? Truly expressing gratitude to Native and First Nations, and not as a way of doing them a favor, because we're not. Giving somebody something that belongs to them is not doing that person a favor. Even if the way that you give back to that person is by, you know, providing some monetary donation to a COVID relief fund. I think that's a fundamentally Western way of relating with folks. And in this particular conversation, it can very easily go back into deep violences, right? Of understanding power in a very specific way and displacing people and the agency that they have and their sovereignty. So we're providing all of these suggestions of ways that we can show up for Native American relatives and give land back, but we're in no ways advocating for your charity or our charity. That's not what the spirit of this is about. It's really important to understand that.
We wanted to finish in a note of commitment, because we both believe that it's really important to place ourselves into the future and to reimagine the change that already haven't happened. And we feel like one really meaningful way to do so is to think about pledging, like making a pledge to what you are committing to doing that's going to be different. And when we think about living in gratitude, and when we think about reimagining what the world would look like as a more fair place, it is both by undoing harm that has been done, by eliminating the harmful myths that exist within our own communities and in this country, but also replacing them with healing traditions and healing both. And we do believe really deeply, Mahahodi and I, that the healing has to start internally. Like, unless you're willing to grapple with the harmful acts and how they have, you know, how they live inside your own body, there's no healing that can take place even outside of our bodies. And so that's what we wanted to end on, a note of healing and a note of placing ourselves into the future. Like when you think about the 7th generation, we say 7th generation because Joy Harjo shared this beautiful dream she had, that she was holding a 7th generation descendant and that she was walking that descendant into the world. And she said to us, she doesn't believe it was a dream, like we understand dreams, but that it was actually happening in real time. Like that was, each of us comes with an ancestor into the world. And she was walking her 7th generation person, like she would be the ancestor doing it. And I mean, Mahodi and I were both on the floor. It was one of the most beautiful, trippy moments of our lives, of like thinking of yourself as being outside of time. And so we invite you today to think of yourself outside of time and to think of yourself as being that 7th generation ancestor. And what are you pledging to do? Mahodi, you wanna tell them? Because we want you to write it down. So
yeah, so this is some homework. We, at the very top of our workshop, we promised we would have some homework for you to do in how you reimagine the holiday. You already have come up with a list of traditions, fiction, and fact as it exists. What we're inviting you to do for homework is to go back, to look at all of that, and to consider where are the places of harm, where are the places that need to be retold and reimagined and maybe even burnished for good, right? And then once you've done that work, where are the places that need healing and tending? Where are the places that need more room, more elbow room, right? I'm thinking about that beautiful painting by Hank and Emily. It's actually their photographs and their invitation of very many different kinds of Americans. So in your own facts and fiction and traditions around Thanksgiving, how can you create more room for all of us to be there, to be reveling and sitting and appreciating Thanksgiving? This is really an assignment that is best done as a letter. So we suggest once you get off the Zoom chat that you write that letter to your 7th generation descendant and you share with them how the world is different given the things that you're committing to do now. So because you have eliminated what needs to go, because you have created space where it was way too crowded and we weren't welcome, because you have given gratitude where it's due, how does the world look different for your 7th generation? That's a wrap, folks.
Yeah, that's it. We want to thank all of you for being with us today. We know that especially with everything that's going on in this country, it has been such a tough time. I know for me personally, it's been a really tough time spiritually. And so, you know, we hope that you feel in community with us and that, you know, just because we're going through a tough time personally or as a country, political upheavals aside, there's still work that needs to be done and we have to stay committed to doing that work. And so we are very grateful to all of you that made time this morning or early in the morning, in the afternoon, depending where you are in the world. We are just so grateful to be in community with each of you and doing this work that needs to be done.
Yeah, and thank you for your messages. You can see Stephanie and Sophia and a bunch of other people dropping notes. We will officially end right now, but we always stick around. We love seeing your notes. If you want to drop something in the chat, please do. And we're going to have actually an Instagram challenge for folks to participate in that is about thanking our First Nation relatives. So look out for that on Instagram and we hope that you participate.
So Krista Bridges, who's been ride or die with us from COVID-19. We love you. You're grateful for us, we're grateful for you. Brett, Mahodi's husband says, such a powerful presentation. Did you pay him for that? Did you to put compliments?
Oh, he knows what's down. He knows what's down.
Our new friends.
Michelle.
Oh, and Sophia, who we're both going to be in. Sophia Thnksgvg. You have to help me with pronouncing your last name. We're both going to be in this alien anthology.
That's right. We're excited.
We're excited about that. It's gonna be great.
Immigrant Nation, baby.
Oh yeah. Lauren, thank you so much. This workshop should be in schools beginning to replace the myth. Oh, Lauren, that's so sweet. And we can learn together because that's the whole point of our model is that we feel like we want to be good relatives. So that means we have to put in the hard work. And sometimes that means that we can really expect to have other people teaching us the work. We have to do the work to educate ourselves. And we've said that too during the summer when a lot of our friends were like, what do I do to be a better ally? Mm-hmm. And we were like, there's a lesson here for all of us about how do we become better allies, is to be willing to do some of the work and to be willing to do some of the heavy lifting too in educating each other. So hopefully this emboldens some of you too. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes sometimes and that we might not always say things that maybe we need to revisit and do it differently. We're always thinking about ways that we can grow ourselves as well. But we're both so committed to this work, right? And it means that we have to be willing to try and take some risks as well.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge, thank you, Susan. Beautiful message there of gratitude. Thank you for being here, Sophia. And Jay, yes, we will definitely send actually the PowerPoint to everybody. So, you have it and you have all of the links. Happy to do that. And we also have some of the notes from the chat. So we'll try and incorporate the resources you guys shared, because there's a lot of good things here that we can call.
What are you cooking for Thanksgiving? Susan wants to know. Everybody put your answers in the chat. Susan, why don't you start? What are you cooking?
Lamb curry. Oh, so there's a okay, so this is going into family traditions. We're not from here, so like turkey's not a thing for us. And my mother makes the most ridiculous lamb curry. There's a huge, I don't know if you guys know this, but South Africa has one of the biggest Indian populations outside of India. So yeah, Susan's making wild rice from Indian country. And look at you, Susan. Look at you. That's fantastic. Thank you. Sharing that info is so helpful. What are you making, Clevis?
Well, my favorite thing to do is not to make, but to consume. My husband's the big cook in my house. So he's gonna be, he's really into turkey. He just started making it actually for his family a couple years ago, and he makes such a delicious turkey. It's really wonderful. So he's gonna make it. I'm hoping that my younger sister comes and makes a pernil, which is like a roasted pork shoulder. And it's just, my younger sister has inherited everything good that comes down the matrilineal lines in terms of cooking. I'm okay in the kitchen, but both my sisters are just incredible. So I invited her to come here, and we're all gonna be really careful about, the health and being safe with each other, but mainly because I want her to make this dish and bring it.
Somebody said earlier that they're going to make Kirsten's dish, and that's one thing that I really want to commit to doing. How do I seafood is a really big deal to me, so I'm really keen to start stocking seafood from indigenous purveyors.
Yeah, me too.
And also, I really want to make that dish that she shared with us. And the point isn't to do it just on Thanksgiving. The point is these foods are here now. How do you embrace that and build it into your diet, right?
So I'm excited. So Karen's gonna do it. She's gonna make the recipe. I'm committing. So those of you that make the recipe, post it on Instagram and share it with us. I'm gonna do that too. I'm definitely gonna make that dish because it looked delicious. I want it.
I know.
Well, it's so wonderful spending time with all of you. Thank you for coming. Yeah. What do you think? Should we let them go?
I think so.
We can be here all day, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. We are continuing the conversation. Hope to see you on the gram with the challenge. And also, hopefully we see you at 2 p.m. with Tommy Orange and Kelly and Wentanosh and Rena.
Yep. Sounds great. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.